Hey everyone, just want to welcome you to the existanew.com podcast. I'm Aaron, and I'm here with none other than Bo DeCourcy.
Of course.
Yeah.
Who else?
We're in the infamous existanew.com studios, which is Bo's kitchen.
Yep.
Looking pretty
Slash
good right
dining
now.
room, yeah.
Slash dining room, yeah. It's a very multifunctional room, which is great. It's great to talk about things here.
Yeah.
So we're really psyched today because we've got a great guest on, someone who I've learned a lot from recently, watching a lot of his videos, reading his posts on his website, that is kind of in accord with some of the things that we talk about at existanew.com. And we definitely have this perspective that, looking to our ancestral past, understanding how we evolved to eat and live is very beneficial to living a better life in modern times. And our next guest is really an expert about this, so we're really psyched to have him on.
Yeah, I think having Dan on is a great honor, actually. And we'd also like to thank Arthur, because Arthur was kind of the hookup through this. Yeah. And Dan is a great resource, and we're very lucky to have him to chat with today.
So I was trying to tease it a little bit, but who we have here today for our special guest, his name is Daniel Vitalis.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, come on, man. You're killing me here.
Well, they can see him. He's right there.
Well, they might not know his name, though. So Daniel Vitalis is a health, nutrition, and personal development strategist. And he's a creator of DanielVitalis.com, as well as SirThrival.com and FindASpring.com, which are all really tremendous resources that I've taken the pleasure of utilizing lately. I think
I have as well.
Yeah, they're really cool. So we really invite people to take a look at those three websites because they're really valuable, and continue to learn.
Right. So why did we want to have Dan on? Well, we're going to actually throw it right to Dan right now and let him kind of give you a little bit of a background about himself, and then we'll tie it in together, and we have some questions to ask him, and then some topics to discuss. And Dan, if you want, can you give us a bit of a background about yourself?
Yeah, I love Dan. That's funny. All right,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's all right. No, it's
Daniel.
All right. Well, I'm Daniel Vitalis, and I guess I'm here today because for the last about 5 years I've been traveling around North America, a lot in the United States, a lot in Canada, teaching different groups, different audiences, workshops and lectures on this topic that I call rewilding. And really been trying to pioneer this movement, which I actually see really growing now, and see so many people catching on to, not just through me, but through so many other outlets, this idea that human beings, and we see it a lot with the these different diets that have emerged recently, where people are starting to go, hey, wait a second, maybe we actually do have some ancestry that informs us how we could live today for greater health. And I think that it's actually pain is what brought people to that place in a lot of ways, because people are realizing, wait a second, all this disease we're seeing, all this obesity we're seeing, all this depression and suicide we're seeing in our culture seems to be because our bodies are breaking down, and we're breaking down not just culturally but physically, and people are starting to realize, wait a second, ancestrally, when we look back, either to people who are modern people but are still living in their ancestral way, or we look back through our fossil record, we see that human beings used to be much healthier, much more fit. Yeah. Actually, we're seeing articles coming out this week talking about how we were more intelligent, our IQs were higher, our dental health was better. We didn't see chronic disease, we didn't see inflammatory diseases, we didn't see degenerative decay, and we're having that now because it appears because we've departed from our natural way of life and our natural lifestyle. So I really dedicated my life to trying to learn about how we used to live. And then I call myself a strategist, because what I do is try to find strategies that we can put into place today that help to replicate or reapproximate some of the old ways, so that as modern people we can take advantages of some of the things that we're adapted to, so that we can be healthier, we can be happier, we can be more intelligent, and we can live in a more harmonious way on the planet. So so that's what I've dedicated my world to, and it sounds like that's what you guys are pretty dedicated to as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's made a difference. I mean, you brought up before that I think people are looking to our ancestral past for greater health because they're in pain, because they're not living well, because we're sick. And that was definitely my path. I was on the path of, being on a lot of medications, going to medical appointments and never really finding answers, and just generally feeling terrible and thinking, there's no way I can spend my entire existence feeling this way. That's just impossible. So I started, I actually found the book Ishmael by Daniel Quinn, which I know you talked
Oh, yeah.
about recently. And that kind of put this, it was like this huge light bulb that went off, like, man, things are way different from before the agricultural revolution. And we've done a lot of things that, in essence, kind of, that Daniel Quinn makes in the point in the book is that we kind of forgot how to live in a certain way. And I started to equate that with how I'm living and how I'm not feeling well due to how I'm living in modern times. And so we've kind of taken it upon ourselves to talk about that.
Certainly. And what I've kind of noticed is everything's speeding up so quickly. It's kind of like not only are we going very fast, but we're accelerating fast. And I think because we're accelerating so fast and so quickly, that we're losing that context even faster. And when we get outside of what we've been calling the ancestral context, when you get outside of the ancestral context, things stop making sense. So what do? We say, well, everybody else has been doing it, so this is just the way it is. And I know that was the way it was for me. And what I found was, instead of, I had some issues, but nowhere to the same degree as Aaron, but I was able to actually optimize myself by kind of recapturing that ancestral context. And I think Daniel has certainly done that. I mean, he's like you said, you've been doing this. I was watching one of your videos. At that time, it was 16 years, and I'm certainly nowhere near that amount of time. But just from beginning, in the last 4 or 5 years, I've seen a dramatic change. But we should probably get into the first topic that we wanted to talk about, was about how your view of domesticated humans. How do you see us as being actually almost a different species? Now, obviously not literally a different species, but we're actually becoming so much different from our ancestors, just by the way that the environment that we're in, and the foods we're eating, and the way we're moving, and the way we're thinking.
Well, it's a really good opportunity, too, to put some of this in context, because some of us and some of the people listening have studied some of this anthropology, sort of our history, and some people haven't, and the timeline can be a little confusing. So some people hear the word ancestor, and they're thinking their great-great-grandparents. Yep. Some people hear ancestor, and they're thinking maybe all the way back to Egypt. Some people hear ancestor, and they think all the way back to the Cro-Magnon people. Some people might think all the way back to the Australopithecines, 4 million years ago. So let's put this into context a little bit. Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about our ancestral way of life, I think back prior to the Neolithic Revolution, which is that agricultural revolution you're talking about. Prior to that, this is probably the most pivotal thing. A lot of people think the most pivotal thing in human history might be the internet. It's actually not. So the most pivotal thing probably in human history is the movement away from living on wild food and moving toward actually domesticating both plants and animals. That today, if you pulled the average kid aside who's texting on their iPhone and you tell them that, it probably doesn't sound like, what's the big deal there? Right, wild food what's the big deal? Well, here's the thing. Prior to that, and right now the current belief is that was 10,000 years ago. You mentioned a few minutes ago that I'd spent 16 years studying this kind of thing. Really, it's more like I've spent 16 years living a lot of it instinctually, and I've learned a lot over the years. And one of the things that I've noticed is that these dates, when we say 10,000 years ago, these dates tend to get moved around a lot. You watch these dates for a decade, they go all over the place. So currently, I'm going to say 10,000 years ago because that's what's currently accepted. I have some questions about it, but currently the idea is 10,000 years ago, the first human beings figured out that they could, or decided to, I think is more accurate, start planting seeds rather than harvesting what was naturally growing around them. So here's the big distinction. Picture the squirrels in the back of your house, right? They don't go around planting oak trees and then waiting for the oak trees to produce acorns and then harvesting all the acorns off. And they certainly don't go clearing huge plots of land and then laying down rows of acorns, right? That's just not how it works. Rather, what they do is they live in some kind of symbiotic relationship with oak trees. and they allow the oak tree to just produce its fruits, and they harvest it, and certainly that helps the oak tree and it helps the squirrel. But they live off of what is naturally produced in the ecosystem. They don't forcefully create artificial eco-environments so that they can then harvest stuff off.
Right.
Well, really, that's true of all the species of the planet. Human beings, though, they diverged from what was natural at some point. Now, it's estimated to be 10,000 years ago. And whenever we hear that story, what we always hear about is that this happened in the Fertile Crescent. But really, it appears now there's more evidence coming that this happened there, but it also happened in China, and it also happened in Peru. So it looks like there was 3 regions of domestication that took place sort of simultaneously. Now, what happened was human beings went from this world, and it didn't happen overnight. We call it the Neolithic Revolution. It makes it sound like there was, you know, pavement out in the streets or something. This, of course, was a slow thing. So people, no doubt, relied very heavily on wild food still. Those would have been plants and animals they would have harvested out of their environment, and they probably grew some things as well. Now, the storyline that we have most firmly in place is that one out of the Fertile Crescent, and what we see is that wheat and barley became very, very central to the food shed of those people. They started to plant fields of these grains. I've really appreciated some evidence that's come to light, or a hypothesis, sorry, that's come to light recently, because the question has been, why did they do that? Because we know that people who hunt and gather live a life of much more leisure than people who plant and garden. That lifestyle of agriculture is actually incredibly abusive to our bodies. And we see in our fossil record that when we started doing that, we saw breakdown, fatigue, wear and tear on the body that we hadn't seen in the fossil record prior to that. So it actually is more harmful to us as well. Why would they do it? Some evidence is emerging that they did it for the production of alcoholic beverages.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That's very interesting, because if you were somebody who harvested wheat and barley, and that was your main staple food, I'm guessing within a week to 2 weeks you would figure out you could make beer from that.
Yeah.
That wouldn't take long, right? You left some porridge sitting around, a couple days later, smells a little funky and sour, you taste it, you get a buzz. Before you know it, you want to reliably be able to create that. Now, of course, wheat and barley were wild foods at one point, and that's what people were using. And eventually they wanted to have that more consistently. That idea of planting food rather than harvesting what was naturally coming up is that great pinnacle movement away from nature. See, prior to that, you couldn't just stay in one place. So if you were going to live off completely wild animals and wild plants, you would have to move around for a few reasons. But one would be that you would start to deplete the food in your area. And because the things that you wanted to eat in the spring were different than what you wanted to eat in the fall, and they would be in different places. So typically people were semi-nomadic. They would have a camp for a period of time, they would pack that up, and they would move from their spring camp to their autumn camp or their winter camp, and they would move around in a circuit as a people group. Yep. Once they started planting, they became what we call sedentary peoples. They would stay put, and this led to the first real villages, which led to the first real cities. Now, that word domesticated means of the house, the house. So we went from being semi-nomadic peoples to these people who were of the house. Right. That change, to me, is the real dramatic change that happened. We talk about, for the astute listener here, I want to bring up a point. We talk about prior to that 10,000 years ago, that Neolithic Revolution, we talk about the domestication of the dog, which happened somewhere in the 15,000 to 100,000 years ago before the present period of time. Mm-hmm. The dog was so-called domesticated. I would disagree a little bit there. I think that's when human beings and dogs started to live together, but those dogs wouldn't have technically been domesticated because peoples wouldn't have stayed put, and therefore they wouldn't have had houses that they lived in all the time. Therefore, no one was of the house yet. Mm-hmm. So we had dogs, and dogs had sort of changed and lived with people from their wild way as being gray wolves, essentially. That happened, but we still lived on our wild lifestyle. We just worked together with dogs, but we lived wildly. 10,000 years ago, things changed. From that point on, there's a process began unfolding. And it leads to one of two things. it leads either to an eschaton, which is a real climax in history, which means his story. I don't mean history in the sense of the history of the planet, I mean our history. Right. Or it leads to a singularity. So one of two things is going to happen resulting from this. We are either going to have that great technological breakthrough, so-called great, where we become sort of cyborg robot gods.
And all connected.
Or we destroy ourselves in a great climax of history. I would lean toward the eschaton is what I see happening. And I think if you go look around, that's what you see happening. But media sells this idea we're heading toward this godhood through technology. And many of the different industries of the planet are pushing that idea. So that you have people today, as you mentioned, they are out of context with how we got here, and they believe that what we're doing is the right thing. And then you have people like ourselves who are looking around going, wait a second, this is leading to death, disease, decay, and unhappiness. And we seem to be destroying not just ourselves, but everything around us. And if we trace it back to where it started, it doesn't start with humans. Humans have been here for 200,000 years. It starts 10,000 years ago with digging a hole and putting some wheat in the ground.
Yeah.
So the domestication. Oh, so to answer your initial question, right?
That's good.
That's awesome.
So the idea, wild human beings, 10,000 years ago living in Mesopotamia, or 200 years ago living in California. I need to really drive that home. The people of California 200 years ago, 300 years ago, were still wild humans too. Those Native Americans, they still lived totally wildly. They had some very limited agriculture, but essentially these were wild peoples. They were Stone Age peoples for certain. They didn't have metal, so these were Stone Age peoples. We could still find some wild Stone Age peoples in South America. We could still find some in Africa. We could still find some in Indonesia, very limited small populations of people living wildly. So it isn't, again, it wasn't a revolution where everybody switched over, right? The people who did switch over immediately started living sedentary lives and started to live in cities. So a civilization, that word civilization refers to people who live in cities. So those people started changing dramatically. Why? Because they changed the environmental pressures that were put upon them. So instead of living in the wild environment, they lived in an artificial environment, right? A kind of artificial reality. And so those people, their bodies started changing. Their brains shrunk. Their skeletons shrunk. They started to develop degenerative diseases of their skeletons, particularly noticeable in their teeth. And they started, over time, they end up in a situation like we're in today, where they have diabetes and heart disease and cancer and the whole array of different degenerative diseases. Those people who were Stone Age peoples, those people who lived on wild foods, I call them, Arthur Haynes calls them, true Homo sapiens or Homo sapiens sapien. We call ourselves today Homo sapiens sapien, and I don't think it's fair. Compared against those people, we're very different. So we call the people of today, Arthur and I, we call them Homo sapien domestico fragilis, to point out that they're not only domesticated, but they're also incredibly fragile, or what we call in biology, gracilized, gracile. They are more slender, more sleek, but also more fragile, and that's us. And so we have this idea of, it's not that we're a different species, it's that we'd be a different subspecies. So case in point would be the dog is that great example. The domesticated dog is the same species as the gray wolf. Even to this day, I've said it 1,000 times, it's so fascinating to me. They're the same species, but they're clearly different. What's the difference? The dog is the domesticated subspecies of the gray wolf. So that's the difference, right? Beets and Swiss chard are the same plant, but they're both different subspecies of that plant. Broccoli and cauliflower are the same plant. They're just different subspecies. That's why they have a different phenotype. They look different. We're the same species as the indigenous people of the world, but we are definitely the domesticated version. And shockingly, all the bright minds of the planet have somehow missed that. And here's why they miss it. They miss it because they think that what we're doing is superior, and they think that the indigenous people of the world are the inferior version of us. And that goes all the way back. We see them called savages, which just means wild, and we are the sort of civilized version, right? The cleaned up version, when in reality we're the sick, diseased, cancerous version, and they are the robust, healthy, environmentally fit version. So long-winded answer to your question is we are the domestical fragilis. Even those of us who are trying to rewild, we're never going to be able to live like those people live. In our brains are changed forever because you grew up on show tunes and Cap'n Crunch, and they grew up, you know, on forest and hunting and gathering.
Yeah. And it's interesting because we talk to a lot of people about this, and they almost can't equate what we're talking about how we lived differently in the past with how we're living in modern times. So they're sick, they're diseased, they don't move very well, but they can't associate that with what they're eating and how they're living. And I think that part of that Bo and I often talk about is we have a lot of diversions from how we're feeling. We have a lot of technological advances that allow us distractions that allow us to be very, very comfortable to just disconnect from our feelings, essentially, where, you know, we have the internet, which is huge, which can be incredibly powerful in terms of connecting people, but it can also be devastating in terms of it's a complete diversion from our actual reality. You can sit in a chair, you can stare at your iPhone, you can be in Facebook for 5 hours, you can be completely disconnected from your body and your health.
Exactly, and from talking with people and working with people and training people, I'll often, you know, start to tell people, well, if you do this, you know, you'll feel better. And the question always comes to this, but why do I need to be fit? And in this, what I've noticed in this culture and in this society, the need for a fit body is gone, right? Like Aaron said, we can roll everywhere. From their point of view, I agree. I agree, Dave.
No, I know you do. I know you do. And they're right, though. Here's the thing. They are more fit for this environment than you or I.
Totally.
I am not fit for this environment. I have anxiety problems in the mall. I don't like the bright lighting of the Apple store. I do not understand what the startup disk on my computer is. I struggle. I don't put my mobile phone against the side of my head. Those behaviors are, they represent poor environmental fitness in the artificial world.
Yes.
Right? However, we take the average person out into the forest. They sound like an elephant, right? All they see is a wall of green. They can't identify food from poison. They are very lucky that most of the great predators of our environment have been removed because they would be basically food on a stick. So they're not fit for the environment of planet Earth, and we are not fit for... Now, what this is a great divergence. If you'll allow me to use a biblical metaphor, I want to be clear here. I'm not coming here as a proselytizing Christian, but I did grow up on that metaphor, and I find the Bible to be a very fantastic book in certain regards. And one of the things that I really enjoy is that it starts off with the story of Genesis, and it tells the story of Adam and of Eve. And they live in the garden, and their only job is to name the different animals and plants, and they live by just picking what they want to eat. In other words, they're hunter-gatherers. They are essentially gatherers, actually, in the story. They live just naturally in the garden. But then some fatal choice is made, and when that choice is made, they're immediately punished. The punishment results in them, here's how the Bible puts it, that from that moment forward, they would have to till the fields for their bread.
Wow.
Right? So in other words, they're going to now grow wheat. And it says, by the sweat of your brow will you bring forth your food. In other words, you're going to have to sweat and labor now to get your food. No longer do you just freely grab it from your environment. It's the story of them moving from being gatherers to being gardeners.
Wow.
And
amazing.
The struggle of that. From that moment forward, it's the story of the different bloodlines that emerge from those people. And it's the story of how history will play out from that fatal movement. It's a domino game all the way to the end. Now, the Bible ends with the story of the Revelation, which tells a story of a great divergence in people. I call it the separation of the wheat from the chaff, and it describes how two peoples will emerge out of that. One will believe in the great delusion, and one will actually follow the truth, but that'll be a much smaller group of people. And it talks about how the delusion is going to be so great that if it were allowed, even those people who were elected to follow the truth would be deceived by it. The only reason we're not deceived by it is because it's not allowed for us, because we have some kind of spirit of truth that lives inside of us. Everyone else will go with that, and they will follow it. And they'll follow essentially an entity that wants to masquerade itself as the great light of the world, but it isn't. It's a deceiving light. And I find that a very interesting metaphor, because that's essentially what I see happening now. People are being deceived by an artificial form of light, technological light, computer screen light, iPhone light. They're being deceived by that, and they're believing that that world is actually what's more real, and they are disregarding the real world. So of course they're more fit for that environment, and of course we're more fit from this environment, and of course that's going to keep playing out further and further till maybe we are not even, and you know, it's right on your shirt right now, I think, that idea of a divergence of two peoples. One people becoming more fit for the environment, one person becoming more fit for the artificial world, to the point that we're not even recognizably the same thing anymore.
Right. We did that on purpose, by the way.
Yeah, it's great.
So you could illuminate it, you know.
Oh, I was hoping. So, you know, it's like a PowerPoint presentation. So really what we're seeing is that, and I think there, you know, those of us who, what we're trying to do is hijack as much of this technology for good as we can. You know, because here's the thing, we're talking about this, and look at where we're sitting right now. It's like, here we are on these machines doing this, but we're hijacking them. It's like the movie The Matrix or something, right? We're hijacking these machines trying to wake people up. Right. But there does come this point, I gotta say, right now I think it's still worth doing the work. I think there's going to come a point where it's less worth it, and where it's more what we're going to have to do is focus on those of us who are awake. Right now, it's like wake as many people up as you can, because the transhuman path is going to lead them to that point where they actually can't even get up off the couch anymore. Right. Right? And we're seeing this, you know, where this is headed. Did you guys see the article that came out recently on 3D printing food?
I haven't seen probably that one, but I've heard about it.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So here's where it's headed, guys. It's headed to, they want to genetically modify all these different species, basically grind these things into these powders, put them into basically like an ink cartridge, and they will print food for people. That food will not be recognizable as anything we consider food today. The three of us and a lot of people listening, maybe some people listening aren't aware of this, so I'll say it, that every food you eat is the body, the corpse of an organism that was alive.
Yep.
This is very important to understand, is that we live off the life of other things. Life force is like this energy that can't be created or destroyed. It gets passed around. So you live by absorbing the life force of other living things. Now this transhuman path, this agenda, wants to isolate and remove people completely from their environment, completely. One of the great hurdles of that is that people still need food that clearly comes from living things. This printable food thing will be that great break, in my opinion. It'll be that point at which food is no longer, it's just shapes and textures. You're not aware that it comes from living things.
Right.
And people are being, in the same way, they're being isolated from sunlight, right? What are the four things we need to stay alive? Well, they're food that comes from soil or earth, it's water, it's air, and it's fire, the sun. We need earth, air, fire, water, right? It's really simple. But human beings are being isolated from all these things. So what's happening is, rather than go out in the sunlight, which we need for our healthy metabolism and for our good mood, we're told that that gives you cancer. And we're told to stay in, and if we do go out, to cover ourselves, to protect ourselves from it. Remember that in the Bible metaphor, Lucifer wants to be the sun, right? He's the usurper of the sun. Yeah. So he wants us to avoid the real sun and convince us that there's this other thing that's better. Right. So we're told not to go out in the sun. We're obviously moving away from the idea of any natural food or connection to earth or soil. Our water is completely processed, and our air is also processed, right? So the idea is we live inside of something encapsulated outside of the ecosystem, and we don't move or exercise. No, we wear our Google glasses, and we interact with the internet all day long. And we don't have real friends. We have artificial networks of people who are non-local, such that you could live in a small pod, like an iPod, and you would not need to interact with real people, but you would think you were interacting with real people. This is, of course, the metaphor of the movie The Matrix. So much so, I know it's cliche, but it's happening. Yeah. People, right? So I don't know my neighbors, and I'm not being hypothetical there. I really don't know my neighbors. Yep. But I have huge networks of people I don't know, but think they know me, and I think I know them, and we pass information back and forth in a kind of surrogate relationship that isn't really that fulfilling, and actually is very, it's very surface, right? It's very artificial, and they don't know about all my little flaws. I can hide them and airbrush them off, right, and round out the edges so I look really perfect, Whereas in a real relationship, I have to expose myself with vulnerability. Facebook gives us that opportunity to never have to share our vulnerabilities or our weaknesses or need to actually have real relationships. I mean, how people don't see this.
We talk
I'm
about
just
that.
shocked.
Yeah.
Where does it go? It goes to where you live in a pod.
Yeah.
And you maybe never even wake up. You're actually asleep all the time, dreaming in an internet, being fed sort of printed food stuff from a machine. And you'll be sold the idea that this is the great movement toward the Star Trek world, when in reality it's the most dystopian reality that could be dreamed up.
Sure. And people would say, well, this is ridiculous. How could this ever happen? I would never start eating 3D food that's completely created out of thin air. Like, that's ridiculous. But as you've pointed out, Daniel, many times, I mean, we're already sitting here. We drink our tap water, and it's completely full of fluoride and chlorine, which we know makes us sick and diseased. And not only
stupid. It lowers your IQ.
Yeah, it makes you stupid. Yeah. And our food is, as we know, with this whole thing going on with Monsanto, our food is becoming increasingly genetically modified, which we know affects our genes and gives us diseases. As you said before, even the air we breathe is completely unhealthy. So I say, do people really stop and look at what they're already doing, that they're accepting as, hey, everybody's doing this, there's nothing wrong with this, like, what else could I do? This is just how things are. And then when you look at that, the step to like 3D created food, it's not that crazy.
Well, we're already eating it. We're already eating 3D created
gummy
food, right?
bears, right? What's a gummy bear?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
At some point, here's the thing about a gummy bear. At some point, there was a living thing that was turned into that, right?
Yeah.
We can't print them. We have to make them in a mold right now. So in the same way that, let me give an example here. Right now, if you want a coat hanger, the coat hanger has to be made in a mold. It's very inefficient because you have to make a factory that produces those coat hangers, and then you need to produce thousands and thousands and thousands of them in order to make the factory worth having.
Yep.
So the idea of 3D printing the coat hanger makes sense to the industrialist who says, wait a sec, this is the wave of the future. Well, right now, gummy bears need a mold. Pretty soon you could just print them. Yeah. I mean, people would rather, the average person, if we went into Chicago and we grabbed somebody off the street there, maybe out of a Macy's or something, and we brought them out and we got them, we brought them to where we were going to slaughter an animal for food, guess what? They can't handle it, right? They would rather have the chicken nugget. Now, the chicken nugget's kind of like that printed food in a way, right? It doesn't resemble a living thing at all, at any level. There's no awareness that and the person eating it will know that it's probably not really that much chicken even in it, right? But they would rather have that than see the truth of what a chicken actually is and where that comes from.
Sure.
So I don't think it's a huge step. And here's the big thing we learned through Manifest Destiny. If you can destroy in one generation, you can actually completely destroy a culture, right? Essentially, all you have to do is sort of kill off the best and brightest, steal off the children, and raise them up in your way. Well, interestingly, I had a friend here the other day. He's from Sweden, and we were talking about how quickly you can eliminate a cultural history. And I said, well, look at you. Tim, you are from Sweden. I'm from the United States. Neither of us are connected to our history lineage. We're not doing the ceremonies of our ancestors. We're not wearing the traditional clothes. In one generation, that's all been eliminated. Right. And he and I might as well be, because of the internet, we might as well be the same culture. Yep. So what happens to the next generation when they're raised literally on printed food? In one generation, you can erase the idea that food even comes from the earth, from soil. I don't think it's going to be that difficult. And I think that the best way to have slaves is to make the slaves believe they want what they have.
Yes.
So what's been really brilliant, what was figured out, obviously, over the course of human domestication, and I'm sure Arthur Haynes has pointed this out to you guys, one of the great things he brings forward is that once you have surplus of food, prior to domestication in humans, there was no surpluses of food. Everybody worked. If you were the chief of your tribe, you still hunted and you still gathered. Yep. You were chief because people trusted you, but you didn't get to sit back like a king while everyone did all the work.
Right.
That doesn't emerge until there's surpluses of food. So once people started growing grains, they were able to get a year, 2, 3 years surpluses of food. Now you had somebody who could rule over that, and you'd have a military class and you'd have a priest class. Yep. Right? Those people have been passing that power on for a really long time. And what they figured out over time was, you know what, it doesn't make sense to brutally suppress people. You have to get people to brutally suppress themselves and think that that's freedom.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So here's the thing. It's not like you're going to have to push processed, printed, genetically modified food on people. They're going to beg for it. They're going to line up for it. Yep. They're going to line up, just like they'll line up to get a microchip if it means they're VIP at the nightclub.
Right. I think you just said a really key term there, and you said freedom. And I think we talk about this a lot, and we also talk about creativity, and essentially using creativity to increase your freedom. And I think what a lot of people don't do anymore is that they're incapable of being really creative. They don't create, they emulate, right? So they think by emulating, being efficient emulators, that they are creators, and they're not. So what you said was the whole, when you drew the likeness between the Bible and currently what's going on, I think that's amazing. That was like, wow. That was a really creative thought, and that makes a lot of sense. People aren't doing this anymore. And I think there's a couple of reasons. Nutritionally, we're not feeding the brain properly, right? Environmentally, we're seeing the same things over and over again. We're actually, like you said, we're emulations of the same people over and over again. So that does make it easy. We get caught in this same track, and we're heading in the same direction. So essentially what we're doing, and what I've written about before, is we're not creating our own freedom. We're designing our own cage. Right? We're being given these options so that we can decorate ourselves to make ourselves think that we want to be within this cage. That, oh, what are you talking about? This is great to be able to have this iPhone and anything at the click of a button I can have information. But what we're finding out is from this recent study I think you referenced earlier is that people are actually, their IQ is decreasing. And it's decreasing, one, obviously nutritionally, but because we don't have the need to actually have skills anymore, right? These skills are different, like you said before, about the way it boots up, the hard drive. That doesn't mean anything to me. It doesn't mean anything to you either, but to some people, they're light years ahead of that, and I've kind of let go of the whole technology thing. And what I've noticed is, I'm kind of glad that I've fallen behind, because that's now fallen behind, right? That's now allows me to seek out people like yourself and like Arthur Haynes, and to get into the original technology, the original knowledge, knowing the difference between food and poison, knowing the difference between a domesticated animal and a wild animal, and making myself closer to becoming more wild, a wild, creative, and free being, because you can't be free if you get caught up in the grid. You really can't. You're playing by rules.
It's interesting because, as you mentioned, for instance, say that you're going to set up a Facebook account, as an example. It's not like you can just go in there and do whatever you want, but you can be creative within the parameters of what's allowed.
Yep.
Right? And so it's sort of like that. Or for instance, if you practice any of the indigenous skills, right? So if you do any experimental archaeology doing primitive skills, and you learn to manufacture things, you learn that you can kind of manufacture anything you dream up.
Yeah.
But once you've been cut off from the idea that you can manufacture, now what you do, your freedom is selecting from available options.
Yep.
So it is very different. It's funny how that works, because the iPhone, as you mentioned, I mean, I can get whatever information it allows within the format that it allows. So it feels like a kind of freedom, but it's not. And it's also destroying our impulse control. And I think that's a huge piece of it.
Dopamine dumps.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of like the monkey who, in the experiment, who gets, a drug every time, gets a shot of heroin every time it pushes the red button. And eventually all it's just doing is just pushing the red button over and over again. It's like can't stop pushing the button.
It's
at its own.
Essentially.
It kind of is, right? And even that's easier now, too. So ultimately, I like this idea there. What do we do? Because here's the thing. There is an amazing little story that comes out of Nazi Germany. The Germans, of course, were during that Third Reich were really obsessed with eugenics. Eugenics is sort of the intentional driving of human evolution, except that it's not the intentional driving of human evolution by the individual. It's the almost fascist just steering of human evolution. That's the big difference. So some of the things that I talk about could almost be seen like, hey, isn't that kind of like eugenics, except it's no, I'm doing it on myself, not having somebody direct my species, right, about how we develop. But anyway, so the Germans were really obsessed with this idea. There's this amazing story in the story of domestication, which, you know, after wheat and barley, it spread out to other plants and some animals as well. And so the early domesticated animals are the goat, the sheep, the pig, the cow. The cow is domesticated from this animal, the auroch. And the auroch was a very, you know, just like any wild ancestor you could imagine, this was like a bison-like animal. It will look more like a bison than a cow. Very powerful, large animal. Well, that animal's been extinct now since the 1600s. And so the cows are all that's left. And that's a big difference between us, say, a dog, and the gray wolf. The gray wolf still exists. Right. So both the progenitor, wild progenitor, and the domestic version live simultaneously on the earth now. Not so of the cow. The domesticated versions here, we've extincted the wild progenitor. The Germans had this idea basically to try to reverse engineer the cow back to an auroch. Right? They thought if they could accomplish this task, that it would be a great symbol of what they thought they were trying to do for the German people, the Aryan race or whatever, right? So these two brothers called the Heck brothers attempted this experiment, and they basically would select the breeding partners of cows that had the traits most like the auroch. And they did reverse engineer out a very cool breed of cow called the Heck cattle, but the Heck cattle are definitely not auroch. They're only half the size. They look very aggressive, but they're not. They couldn't do it, essentially. Brings me to where we're at today. It was attempted. It did not work. What they learned out of that is we can't take broccoli and reverse engineer it back to the wild Brassica oleracea. It won't work, right? Wow. Now here's where we're at as humans. We still coexist right now, the domestic version with the wild version. So there are still some indigenous people, and there's 7 billion domestic humans as well. But the indigenous people are going to be extinct very soon, and that's going to leave us only here by ourselves, and we aren't going to be able to reverse engineer ourselves.
Right.
So what are we going to do?
There goes
we
the
can
context.
become feral. We can't become wild again, but we can become feral. So I sometimes think about the way that a dog can escape domestication and go back to living sort of wild again. We call it a feral dog. I think the path forward for humans, some of us, is to become feral humans and begin to do this rewilding thing where we slowly, piece by piece, start emerging back into our ecosystem. And it's going to take probably multiple generations.
Wow.
Interesting. So, Daniel, do you think that there is some sort of like elite class, or, you know, some sort of, who's driving all this? So in other words, is there a group of people that has the intention to domesticate humans and genetically modify them in order to control them? Or is this just kind of like everybody, even the elite class of people here, everybody's just caught up in a system that doesn't work and no one can really figure out whose fault it is anymore?
Both.
Yeah.
So my opinion, we're going way, so the stuff that I've been talking about before, as crazy as it sounds, I want the listeners to know that you could actually look up the studies that are informing the things that I'm saying. So even if I sound like totally off the wall with this, all this stuff actually is true. So now we're going to go into Daniel's personal, masturbatory fantasies about what he thinks is going on planet Earth. Sure. Both. I think both. I had a really wise teacher talk to me about this. He was a martial arts teacher of mine, and his background was in Army intelligence. And so he had lots of top secret clearances. And he would argue with these conspiracy ideas that there are elites running the world for reasons, the things that he had seen. And his view on it from a spiritual perspective was this, that there are archetypical roles that have to be played, and there will always be somebody to fill that void. So due to the way that we're living, it creates a role where somebody is going to direct choices being made at incredibly high levels. And there are individuals who will step into those roles, right? But the role isn't necessarily created by the individual as much as it's created by the collective through how the choices we're making. So I think that both things are going on. But I do think, that these things are being directed at very high levels. But I also think the following, and that's this, that those people who are directing a lot of these things are they can't escape it themselves.
Yeah.
I suspect that they can, but I don't believe that they can. So, for instance, if you spray aerosols into the atmosphere from airplanes, you breathe that too. Mm-hmm. You genetically modified the food supply. Eventually, you eat that too. And they also live in domesticated sick bodies too. And I think that, yeah, they're destroying more than they realize. But I think that they're very heavily deceived. And I think that they think they can do a lot more than maybe is reality. So, yeah, I think there's a massive deception. I talked about it earlier, a great delusion. And I think those people are probably bought into that delusion at levels that we can't even imagine.
Yeah.
Who knows? And but yeah, I do think that there are those directing it. Yet I do think also the moment that we left our natural lifestyle and we started to embark down this journey, I don't know if there was ever any turning back. I feel like a process began to unfold then, and all things have to, everything has a beginning and everything has an end. And it's like, I think it just has to play out. And it's taken probably 6,000 to 10,000 years.
So when you say everything has to end, I know this is kind of hyperbole, but what do you think that's going to look like when you say everything has to end?
Wow, that's a huge question. I mean, obviously, like, if I wish I knew, right? If
yeah,
I did,
exactly.
I'd be selling my audiobook on or whatever, my ebook on how to prepare for that. I do think, though, it's worth looking at the other civilizations who've tried similar experiments to us. Mm-hmm. So let's look at those, civilizations. We could look at the Sumerians. Oh, yeah, wait, they're gone. We could look at the Babylonians. Oh, gone. Mm-hmm. The Egyptians, gone. The Greeks, gone. The Romans, gone. The British Empire, gone. This has not been sustainable. Mm-hmm. Now, this is known. This is understood, right? I'm not the first person to talk about this. I mean, every civilization, not culture, important distinction. When we're talking about a tribe of indigenous people, that's a culture, but not a civilization. A civilization is people who build cities. Yep. Every city-building people has destroyed themselves. They rot from the inside. Typically, they destroy their soil. It seems that that's the main thing that happens. They desertify their land. Now, I often point out to people that the Egyptians desertified Egypt, that Egypt, when it was a great kingdom, was not sand dunes like we see today, right? We picture that. It's so, we're crazy. Yeah. As if, picture those 3 pyramids in the sand dunes, like all those people lived there. It's like, no, that had to have been green and lush and full of food.
Yeah, it seems like that should be a logical connection, but we don't.
But we're stupid now. We eat fluoride in our water. So that turned to a desert because of how they farmed it. Yep. Now, I often ask this, were the farming practices of the Egyptians more sustainable than ours? Yeah, I bet they were. They were beyond what we'd call organic today. Yeah. So what is this gonna result in?
There's also far fewer people.
What's that?
Also far fewer people too.
Right. So all civilizations in the past have collapsed. None are still present. We visit their ruins on our vacations, right? We also see that they had while different types of technology, they achieved feats that we can't achieve today. So in many ways, these were great peoples, and we need to keep that in mind. Sure. However, they still destroyed themselves through their own folly and their way of life, which is the way of life we are also exploiting, except we're doing it in a way that is far more obnoxious ever before. I believe that those leading minds, those elite minds of the world understand this, and so they're pushing very fast now, very hard, trying to achieve this thing, the singularity they call it. Yep. Right? Really, if we could uncover the religion of the elite of the world, we would find that it's transhumanism, and that its messiah is the superconscious machine, and that's what they're trying to bring into this dimension or onto Earth. Now, if they can hijack the codes of reality,
I don't know what happened exactly, but
oh, good. Do you know where I left off?
Yeah, you were talking about the singularity and transhumanism.
Yeah,
and
okay.
Religion.
I can just pick up. Tell me when we're recording.
We're good. We're going right now.
Okay, so I believe that the people who are really managing, it's funny because I think one of the things the internet has given us is the realization that this whole thing of like a conspiracy theory is kind of getting blown out of the water. The only people still really calling it a conspiracy theory are the people who are the ones implicated in these conspiracies. And other than that, most people realize, whoa, fact checking allows us to recognize, obviously, how all the governments of the world work. Of course, they're businesses. And just like I have a business, is it a conspiracy when I get together with the people who work in my company and we come out with a product launch? Is that a conspiracy? Because we get together in a room and talk about what our next part of our plan is? Yeah. Of course governments do this. Of course this stuff is going on. And of course these issues we're talking about get raised, right? The elite of the world, especially the technocratic and scientific elite, they understand that there's a ticking clock right now. They know that. They are running from a fate that no civilization has escaped. Yep. But they think if they can pull off, here's what they need to pull off in order to make it work. They need some kind of free energy source. They need effective biotechnology. And they need nanotechnology. If you have the energy to take the building blocks of reality and build anything you want, and to take the building blocks of life and construct anything you want, you could essentially escape the Earth altogether, right? And go travel through space, manufacturing life forms and food with your free energy, right? You could manufacture ships forever. You could mine any planet, any moon, any asteroid for the building blocks you need for nanotechnology, right? Yeah. So the idea is we become techno-gods. Star Trek, right? We leave behind. So they know what they're doing, but they think they can get to that before the collapse of our civilization happens. Gotcha. Hence, accelerate the programs, right? Why is Monsanto given free license? We just saw today that their genetically modified wheat has escaped, and we're seeing that it's now showing up on all of these farms around the country. Why are they given free license to do this? Because it's part of the agenda. They need to advance this if they're going to escape this fate. Right? Why are they allowed to produce nanotech and just let it out like this? Why is this not regulated? Right. It's part of an agenda to escape the fate of civilizations that no civilization before has escaped. So, yeah, I don't know. Is that a conspiracy? I don't know. We work at the lowest level. We work at the lowest level, right? We're on first floor. And we don't know what decisions are being made up in the penthouse, but we're not involved in those decisions. But those decisions involve a world that we can scarcely imagine. I don't personally think they're going to pull this off, but I think they're going to get a lot closer to it. Yeah. And I think things are going to look a lot weirder. And for a lot of us, they're going to be a lot scarier. Yeah. And I think we have to go through that time that the Bible calls a tribulation. I think we're going to go through a really challenging time. And heads up, I think it's going to get really weird in 2014 because we're about to move into this time where that Google Glass is going to come. And effectively, that will be that first really mainstream cyborg technology. Yeah. So for the first time, human beings and machines are going to merge like that, where they'll actually be displays over people's eyes. Right.
I think, right? I think what Aaron and I were talking about and going on to this Google Glasses thing is we referenced earlier the Matrix, and we were talking the other night, and rather than we be in a simulation, that some people think simulation theory, that we're living in a simulation, I don't think that's the case. I think we're not all laying down right now plugged into each other. Rather, we have this small little mechanism already developing inside of our brains. So we're like the Matrix on Wi-Fi, right? We're wireless. So we're actually moving around together. So when people talk about this, the singularity that you have mentioned before, technically we're already pretty close, because right now we have to use these outdated mechanisms called iPhones. But as we develop, as you were just talking about nanotechnology, we're actually already training ourselves to be in the Matrix, essentially, in a way that it's an idea, it's a thought that's growing inside of us, and whatever means that takes, if we're dumbing us down through nutrition and losing the context in completely creating a hyper reality. I think we're actually we're further along than we actually think we are.
Yeah, that metaphor of the algae that grows across the lake right, by doubling each day, if you've heard that
Yes.
metaphor,
Yeah, I've
right?
heard that, yeah.
That if it doubles every day, the day before it completely covers the lake, it only is halfway covered.
Yep.
Then if it doubles that net, so you're watching it grow, you're watching it grow, you're watching it grow, it's only halfway, we've got plenty of time, bam, next day. Think about this machine, this idea of the singularity, right? The idea of superconscious machines. We're programming those machines right now, right? So if you have an iPhone, here's what it looks like. That you're feeding the data into the system of everything that it is to be human, right? You're feeding it information of every conversation you have via text or email. And then right after you say the thing, I love you, baby, what that then causes you to go search. Yeah. And then when you search that, when you see that with those colors and those pictures, what that causes you to want to look up next. And then what that causes you to want to go say to the next person. And we're feeding all the data points into it. Mm-hmm. We're building this super conscious machine. Now, here's the thing. Google Glass, again, and of course it won't just, you know, Google's the one to watch, by the way. But anyway, I love the name. It's so feel-good compared to like omnipotent control grid or something.
Yeah, totally.
But here's the thing. We imagined in the 1980s that cyborgs would be these people with like a hacked off, still bloody limb with like machine parts sticking out of it. That's really old school thinking, right? It's kind of like when you watch a 1950s space travel movie and everything still looks 1950s, but to them it was futuristic. Yeah. And now this stuff looks old school. That kind of cyborg with the like machine flesh intermingling, that's old school. Yeah, that's not the way it's going to work. The way it's going to work is it doesn't have to poke into you. That's stupid. Right. What are you going to live on an antibiotic drip forever with like open cyborg wounds?
That's pretty much. Most bizarre.
The way it will work is that the stuff will actually go on you. For instance, the RFID chips now, everybody's worried about the chip, right? We're going to implant us with RFID chips. If you've seen, the new chips are actually called electronic tattoos. Yep. And they stick on the outside of your skin and they bond to you electrically. So this stuff isn't going to need to go in you. That actually poses a lot of problems. This stuff's going to go outside you. And the cyborgs will wear their interface like an exoskeleton. They're not going to have it go inside them. Mm-hmm. Again, that's just old school thinking. Mm-hmm. So we're about to see the beginning of the cyborg interface. It's going to start probably in 2014. And the interesting thing is that anything anybody looks at is being recorded at that point. So we then move into, or can be recorded, I should say. So we're moving into not only the cyborg world, but also the total surveillance world beyond what we can even imagine, all at the same time. So yeah, it's just going to get weirder and weirder from here out. And I think really it's like strap in and have a strategy. My strategy is my alliance is with nature, and it's never going to be with any of these. It's not with where people are going. I'm not aligned with the fragility. My alignment's with nature. So in the meantime, we live half and half, right? We live in both worlds. But if I have to make that decision at any point, my move is into the forest, not into the cities. And yeah, it's going to get dystopic. It's dystopic now, sure, but it's going to get weirder.
Yeah. So, Daniel, for people that are listening to this and going, oh, man, like, I'm screwed. I don't know what to do anymore. I just feel hopeless.
You mean they're not saying, oh, my God, this guy's completely off his rocker. Is this sci-fi?
Well, maybe they're saying that, too. No, I'm just kidding. No, I mean, I think there's a lot more people out there that you said that do get this and are thinking, man, what can I do? Because I don't want to be a part of this. Like, even if the whole thing is going down, then I don't want to perpetuate that. I don't want to be a part of that. So I think that one of your antidotes to all these issues is you call it rewilding. And maybe I know that this is complex and you talk a lot about it on danielvitalis.com and you have surthrival.com and findaspring.com, which are all components of that. But maybe if you could give us just some basic examples of how can someone say, okay, I don't want to be this completely domesticated human anymore. I want to understand how it is to be more wild in this modern age. If you could give us maybe some basic examples.
Yeah, I would, and I want to give one caveat first, which is that there's an idea that I call ecotopia that's incredibly seductive. Mm-hmm. It's a very seductive idea that there's going to be some merger of technology and nature and that we can find a way to create this world where we all live in harmony with technology and nature and all that. Mm-hmm. I would really ask people to think that through a few steps. like as if you were playing chess. You don't just make random moves. You think through what will happen if you make that move. What move will that person make? What 4 moves could they make? And if they did, what moves would you make? You got to think 3 moves ahead. When you're thinking ecotopia sounds awesome, think it through, because it ends up looking a lot like Marxism real fast. So think it through. Because I know some people are hearing me going, yeah, but there's this way where we could have it all.
Yeah.
Think it through. Who's in charge of that world? Okay, anyway, rewilding. Wow. Well, here's the thing. So what's the problem? The problem is we're being isolated off. I often make a joke about that old John Travolta movie, The Boy in the Bubble. We're like the boy in the bubble, right? We're being isolated away from nature. I think the best example would be where you're born, for instance, right? We're born into so-called sterile environments under artificial lights, fluorescent lights. There's no soil. The air is completely thermoregulated, processed via machines. There's no natural water. All the water is fluoridated and chlorinated, right? There is no nature present, right? Your hospital room might as well be on the Starship Enterprise. That's how removed it is from natural environments, right? Of course, we also see that hospitals are the place where you're most likely to develop diseases that can't even be cured by antibiotics. It's a very dangerous place.
Right.
So we need the opposite of that. That's the problem. The problem is we're being harvested out of nature. So what we got to do is start to reintegrate with nature. Here's the strategy that I think makes the most sense. We recognize, again, you need those 4 elements, right? Earth, water, air, fire. Those elements could also be called food, water, air, sunlight. Those are the 4 things we need. We got to start interacting with those things the way they were meant to be interacted with. Now, food's the big one, but it's also the most challenging one in certain ways. So we can't just jump. Nobody's jumping to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle tomorrow. Arthur Haynes is, by the way, one of those people I think most far along on that path with the food. He's more advanced in that than most people that I've ever met, encountered, or even heard of that started as fragility. And yet he's not a total hunter-gatherer, right? So even at that level, that incredibly advanced level that he's at, he's still having to he's still on the spectrum working his way back to the ideal goal. So that's all of us. So it depends where, if your food right now is all from Safeway, the idea that you're going to be a hunter-gatherer in 2 weeks, not realistic, right? So what we do is we make a movement from Safeway to maybe Whole Foods. And from Whole Foods, we start to get with our local farming community, and we get involved with CSAs and farmers markets and that kind of agriculture. From there, we move towards growing our own garden. From there, we can move towards permaculture. From there, we can move towards that foraging lifestyle where we start to hunt and gather more. Now, at any point on that chain, you can jump to foraging and hunting. That's cool, right? So even if you're at a lot of people who eat at Safeway still hunt, right? That's really cool. A lot of people who live rather normal lives still have certain plants that they harvest. So at any point, we can jump towards some of that ideal stuff. But there's also a spectrum we can move slowly along too, and that's important. So really, the big move is once we get to organic. Currently, we know we're out of the GMO loop for the most part, which is awesome. So that's really important for us to do, get away from genetically modified foods. These things change us too, and that evidence is emerging, and I don't have time to go into that. When it comes to water, we need to be really conscientious about the fact that the water that we are drinking is processed water. There's an article up on my website, danavitalis.com right now, on wild water, and in there, I say that people think of food, they're comfortable with saying processed food. Nobody really has thought yet to call it processed water, but that's starting to emerge. People are realizing, oh, wait a second, water's not all just water. The water in my tap is water that's gone through processes, and it is not real, natural, wild, raw, unaffected water.
Yeah.
Water in an ecosystem is incredibly different. First of all, water in an ecosystem has life forms in it. Right? If we go and we harvest some natural water from a spring, from a lake, from a river, we put it in a glass bottle and we leave it out in the sun for a couple of months, it's going to turn green with an algae bloom. Why? Because there's organisms in it. It turns out that those microorganisms have nutritive effects on our body. And they have effects on our body that we really might want to get happening again. Like, for instance, when we eat these microbes, some of these soil and water microbes cause us to produce more serotonin. Yeah, and it's been shown that with studies with rats, for instance, when they're deprived of these kind of organisms that are in soil and water, that they actually don't navigate mazes as well, that they're more intelligent when they get soil and water-based organisms into their body.
Wow.
So there's stuff in water, first of all, at the microbial level, at the biological level, that we need. Now, all that water that we get in bottles and taps is sterilized. It either has an antibiotic in it, chlorine, or it's been through types of filtration and treatments in bottling plants where they remove all life forms. That's why water can sit in a bottle and never turn green if it came out of your tap or if it comes from a store, because they've sterilized it. So essentially what they've done is pasteurized the water, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's the difference between raw milk and pasteurized milk.
Sure.
The second is that these waters are in our taps are often fluoridated, and the whole thing of like fluoride's good for your teeth, I mean, that's just out the window at this point, right? That's old news. Everybody who's studied this has determined, no, it's not true. It's neurotoxic. It actually lowers IQs in children. We can see that. It fluoridates the pineal gland more than any other soft tissue in your body, and having it in your teeth is a disease called fluorosis, and it makes your teeth brittle and they chip and break more easily because they lose their elasticity. So that idea that we need that, just not true. It destroys willpower. That bottom line, that's what you need to know. Additionally, most waters end up having some demineralization process happen, which removes nutrients that we need. So anyway, we got to look towards water that is actually comes from the natural environment. It isn't changed. Two ways to do that. The one I'm really fond of is spring water, and that's why I created findaspring.com. That's just been rebuilt. It's a completely new website now. But that's a site where you can go, you can look on the map in your area, you can find springs near you, you can go right to those springs and gather water that's completely safe and healthy for you right from the earth. And if you find other springs, you can add them to that website. So that's a really cool database. The other way would be through artesian wells, where you can get access to water that comes from underground and nobody's treating it. It's not just fluoride and chlorine. It's also phosphoric acid and sodium hydroxide. That's one that nobody talks about. So here's the thing. When you deliver water through miles and miles and miles of old beat-up pipes that were put in the ground during Lincoln's presidency, that's how old most of the country's water infrastructure is, and those pipes are eroding and decaying and breaking down. The problem is you've got to keep that water at exactly the right pH, or it'll cause stuff to build up and grow, because minerals will fall out of solution and attach inside the pipes and clog it up. So they constantly inject alkaline substance and an acid substance in order to maintain that, and that's delivered to you at your tap. So that stuff's in there. When you shower in that, you crank up that water nice and hot. All that chlorine and all the organisms that have been killed by that chlorine, they get heated up, and some of that stuff volatilizes as chloroform gas and other gases that you then breathe. So this stuff is like gas chamber, because our bathrooms tend to be sealed up little units in our showers too, and then we inhale that stuff. You got to get away from that. If you live on municipal water, get a shower filter. If you're really into this rewilding thing, you move to where you can have a well, so that you don't have to deal with that. On the air level, you got to get your windows open as much as possible and get outside as much as possible. Because the thing is that people are living inside they're inside over 90% of the time. So we're hyper-domesticating. Domestication means you're of the house. What are we when we're like 95% of the time indoors? Now, every substance that's unnatural in your house is outgassing. And usually it's outgassing volatile organic compounds like formaldehyde. And when we seal up our homes, we end up sealing ourselves in that. And the air indoors is always more toxic than the air outdoors. And so we're breathing this stuff. And it's when you breathe it, it doesn't just go in your lungs and back out your lungs. It goes in your lungs, dissolves into your blood, and circulates to all your tissues. So what you end up doing is delivering volatile organic compounds to all your cells. It's not just like, it's like when you drink water. You don't drink water and then there's like a tube that goes down to where you pee, and then it just comes out. It comes to your blood, and anything in that water goes in your blood and then to all your cells. So anyway, we got to get exposed to natural air again. Yep. The other piece is getting outside in sunlight. Again, I choose to live out in a place where I can get up in the morning and walk naked outside because I don't have neighbors who can see me, and I can spend a lot of my time naked outdoors, and I think that's critical. Exposing as much of your skin as you can to the sun. That's what you're designed for. Now, your skin, of course, will produce more melanin, and you'll have a nice tan, and when you have a tan, you always feel better, and everybody knows that. And I mean, obviously, right? But now what are people doing? They actually won't go in the sun, and then they go to tanning booths. Yep. What? So you can actually go out in the sun, and you can produce more vitamin D and you can produce more serotonin, and you can regulate your melatonin levels, and then you're getting earth, water, air, and fire. Now, how do you put all this stuff together? You spend more time outside. Right? That's where it all is. That's where it's happening. That's where these soil microbes are, and the water is, and the air is, and the sunlight. And obviously getting to do things like camping and living on the land, even temporarily, are great ways to have rewilding immersion sessions where you actually get to get your head screwed back on right. I mean, how does it feel when you get outside of the bubble? Now, the thing that we also want to do is we want to start avoiding, as much as we can, artificial foods, artificial processed water, artificially processed air. If you're like, what does he mean processed air? I mean, like when you go in the hospital or you go in a high-rise building, it's not like the windows are open. That's just air going through machines being recycled. That's air that's already been breathed again and again and again and again and again. You're breathe the air. You need fresh air. And we need to avoid being in the presence of a lot of artificial light. And that's one of the big challenges because these machines emit a lot of light. So it's just this process of moving towards what makes sense and is natural, and as much as we can, avoiding the stuff that's clearly artificial.
Wow.
Pretty wild in a nutshell.
Yeah. That's an impressive nutshell. No, that was extremely helpful, and I think we've taken up quite a bit of your time, so we probably should let you go.
I have that battery about to die.
Oh, yeah.
Message.
Cool. We want to urge everybody definitely to go check out danielvitalis.com. We'll post this on our website and our Facebook at existsanew.com. Check out sirthrival.com. It's an amazing website. And also find a spring. It's something that I've used to start collecting spring water, and it's made a big difference. Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah. So we really urge people to go and check that out. So we really want to humbly thank Daniel Vitalis for spending some time with us today. This was a really fun conversation and very illuminating, and we really appreciate it very much.
Yeah, and we appreciate the whole. We went kind of deep there, and I think that's important because a lot of people aren't exposed to those types of ideas that we were discussing earlier, and even if some people were a little threatened by them and they might not believe in them, it's still something that you should hear, and you know, it takes some brave people to actually start discussing that and disseminate it out into the ether. So thank you very much for engaging in that with us.
Yeah, you know, and I'll just leave it with this. You know, if you're not sure what to think of everything that I've been talking about, just think of it all like a little seed that's in your mind. Now, this is a wild seed, not a domesticated seed. Right. If it was a domesticated seed, you'd need to pour water on it and till the soil and do all these things to get that seed to grow. This is a wild seed. You don't have to do anything. Let these thoughts marinate in your mind, and if they turn into something valuable to you, great. And if they don't, let them die. Yeah. But I think you'll find that a lot of these things will grow on their own. Because that's just sort of the nature of things that are wild.
Yeah. Excellent. Thanks. All right. Well, once again, Daniel Vitalis, thanks so much, and hopefully we'll connect again soon.
Yeah.
Yeah. Too.
Thanks, Daniel. Have a good one.
Okay.
Yep.